Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Ali Zia Jaffery, and I welcome you to the CNS webinar entitled The Changing Dynamics of Nuclear Crises in South Asia, What Lies Ahead. Ever since the advent of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Academy has dealt with questions related to their effects on state behavior, especially with reference to the use of force. Popularized by Robert Jervis and his fellow travelers, the theory of the nuclear revolution argues that the possession of secure, survivable nuclear capabilities creates mutual vulnerabilities, making military victories meaningless and crises infrequent. All this, the theory contends, attenuates security dilemmas and stabilizes nuclear relationships. Although the theory is compelling, it has been critiqued by many a scholar, not least because states have behaved at odds with it. The difference between this theory and practice is quite stark in South Asia. Since going overtly nuclear in 1998, India and Pakistan have embroiled in four nuclear tense crises that threaten to reach the precipice. The previous Indo-Pak crisis not only saw both countries use air power, but also threatened missile strikes against each other. The said crisis raised many a question in academic and policy communities. To me, four questions are worth dabbling in. First, how have successive crises affected Pakistan's crisis behavior and the nuclear risk landscape? Second, what accounts for India's growing risk acceptance behavior? Third, how and why have the roles of third parties, not least the US, evolved as crisis managers? Last but not least, what does all this mean for deterrence? To, dis- to discuss these questions, we are fortunate to be joined by four eminent scholars in Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Ruhee Neog, Dr. Christopher Clary, and Dr. Jeffrey Knopf. Before introducing them, I would like to invite Sam Nunn and Richard Luger, Professor of Nonproliferation Studies, Middlebury Institute, and Director CNS Dr. William Potter, to share his opening remarks. I cannot do justice to his profile, but I would be remiss if I don't mention that apart from his prolific scholarship on the Soviet nuclear program, arms control, non-proliferation, and nuclear terrorism, he has been instrumental in institutionalizing the training and development of a generation of non-proliferation and disarmament scholars. Thank you so much, Dr. Potter. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ali. I thought I was probably invited to moderate or to say some opening remarks at this seminar because I suspect the only person around our virtual room who can remember firsthand the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I suspect I've trained multiple generations of students in this domain. But I must say one of the most satisfying experiences of being a professor and a center director at MIIS is the opportunity to work with exceptionally talented students. Their energy, their idealism, their creativity, probably more than anything else, is what has kept me going over more decades than I'd like to recall. And in a moment, I'll turn to one of those students who's just spoken, Ali, to moderate the seminar on the changing dynamics of nuclear crises in South Asia, what lies ahead. I've written a lot about forecasting proliferation developments, as well as forecasting more generally. And I have to confess to counting myself in the camp of those who are skeptical of the ability of most experts to provide compelling prognoses of what lies ahead, be it with respect to the spread of nuclear weapons, the future of the nuclear order, the evolution of regional and political groupings in multilateral diplomacy, and the ability of states to avoid future nuclear crises. Also coloring my attitude is the low confidence I have in rational decision-making, including with respect to decision-making in crisis situations. Therefore, I'm very pleased to give the responsibility for moderating the session to Ali, who knows far more than me about the changing dynamics of nuclear crises in Asia. He'll now introduce our very distinguished speakers and may also wish to comment on the subject of today's seminar. So I'm pleased to hand the virtual podium back to you, Ali, and I really look forward to hearing from some of my old friends, some new acquaintances, and also to listen attentively to the discussion, which I'm sure will follow after our provocative presentation. So the floor is yours, Ali.
Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Potter, for your remarks and for your words of encouragement, which have always been inspirational. Um, Now it is an absolute honor for me to invite and introduce Dr. Rabia Akhtar, who has inspired and shaped me as a person and professional. Dr. Akhtar is Director, Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Lahore, and Editor, Pakistan Politico. She is also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the British American Security Information Council. A Fulbright alumna, Dr. Akhtar received her PhD in Security Studies from Kansas State University. Her research culminated in a book entitled The Blind Eye: US Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan from Ford to Clinton. Dr. Akhtar has written extensively on deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, and foreign policy for reputed international publications. Dr. Akhtar had previously done fellowships at the Stimson Center, Cornell University, and the Regional Center for Strategic Studies. She's a regular participant in international conferences and dialogues on nuclear issues. Currently, she's also associated with the Asia Pacific Leadership Network and the Belfer Center, Harvard University. In recognition of her work, she was inducted in Prime Minister Imran Khan's Advisory Council on Foreign Policy. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia, for joining. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for such a generous introduction. I hope I'm audible to everybody. I would like to thank CNS and Dr. Potter. Finally, we get to meet virtually, hopefully in person too, soon, someday. I would like Ali to bring up a mind map that I'd made for my talk because it's like really difficult to talk about the subject in 5 to 7 minutes. But I've tried to sum it up as concisely as I could. So Ali, can you share the screen, please?
Is the screen visible to all? Okay, great.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I'll just quickly, take you through this. This mind map, it provides a comparative analysis of the evolving landscape of nuclear risk reduction between India and Pakistan from the aftermath of the Kargil War in 1999 until Pulwama crisis in 2019. And it sort of just lists key events, diplomatic engagements, shifts in military strategy under the nuclear umbrella that have influenced risk reduction measures and perceptions of nuclear threat between the two South Asian nuclear powers. Now, the list is not exhaustive because I couldn't get everything on there, but I just want to highlight some key, clusters here. So the first one that you can look up is from 1999 to 2002. And this is the period where both India and Pakistan have had Kargil War and the Twin Peaks crisis of 2001-2002 standoff. The risk reduction measures following these two, a short war and a crisis were Lahore Declaration. There was in 1999. Then there was an establishment of a hotline to prevent accidental nuclear war. And then there were mutual agreements on pre-notification of ballistic missiles tests that came out in 2005. The impact on relations was temporary escalation followed by efforts to stabilize the situation through diplomatic channels and confidence building measures. We now move to the period of 2003 to 2008, and this was the period where both countries came together to conduct a composite dialogue process. There was an introduction of several nuclear CBMs, and as all of you who study nuclear South Asia know, and I'm not going to list it all here, but these included agreements on reducing risks from accidents, for example, relating to nuclear weapons that came out in 2007. And there we saw gradual improvement in bilateral relations with increased diplomatic engagement and initiation of some trade talks between the two countries. The next period is between 2008 to 2014. And 2008, we saw Mumbai attacks. And, even though Mumbai attacks, did not lead to a direct confrontation of kinetic confrontation between India and Pakistan, there was resumption of composite dialogue post-crisis. There was continuation of the agreement on non-attack on each other's facilities. Mumbai attacks happened in November 2008, and in January of 2009, both countries, exchanged those lists. We saw the relations were strained post Mumbai attacks, but there were signs of recovery through resumed dialogue and agreements that were in place. We moved to 2015 to 2019, and we have seen the Pathankot attack, we have seen the Uri attack, and we have seen Pulwama attack. We have seen limited diplomatic engagement between the two countries. We've seen cross-border strikes that were surgical strikes by India in 2016 and Balakot strike in 2019. And we have seen post August 5th, 2019, significant deterioration in relations between the two when India revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir. We saw increased military tensions and a focus on showcasing deterrence capabilities over dialogue. So this is a broader, snapshot from 1999 to 2019. Ali, can you move to the next page, please? All right. In this map, I've mapped the risk-taking behavior and stability in the India-Pakistan divide. And instability and instability is a bit of a question mark here. We have seen that both countries have taken calculated risks, and calculated risks with non-military and preemptive strikes within the escalation pattern. We have seen that non-state actors and asymmetric warfare, has been a very key feature in their relationship. We have also seen, Indian disinformation campaign as part of the asymmetric warfare against Pakistan, support of BLA, TTP, and execution of entities on Pakistani soil, which have just been released. There has been a complicated security environment due to the presence of non-state actors on both sides, leading to potential inadvertent escalation. We have then seen domestic political dynamics between the two countries having an effect on their behavior during crises. Domestic political pressures, can drive governments to take stronger action to satisfy nationalistic sentiments. While we see that this has been more pronounced in India than in Pakistan, but if there were casualties, for example, in Pakistan post BrahMos cruise missile accident, then the domestic pressure would have been different. Can we say that this is a stable shift? I think more stable, this shift has been more stable because of crisis management practices that have been in place, and largely the credit directly doesn't go to India and Pakistan. The credit goes to third parties who have been brokering peace between the two countries and the overall, deterrent effect of nuclear weapons. So these two, need to be kept in mind if we think that the divide has seen some stability. With respect to some unstable shifts, I believe that potential instability due to miscalculations and evolving military doctrines and domestic political pressures all have had an effect to make this shift in behavior unstable. We have recently seen Indian Agni 5 MIRV missile test. Pakistani spokesperson said that, yes, we have taken a note of the test because India, even though it mentioned according to the agreement that they both had signed, India did not follow the protocol of 3 days timeline as per Article 2 of the agreement, where India needs to notify about ballistic missile test. It might be a small irritant, but what if the next time the test happens and, conveniently some other article is not followed through? I'm sure other speakers, my fellow panelists, will talk about the Brahmos cruise missile miscalculation. What next? What will be the next iteration of it? The jury is still out whether it was an accident or it was deliberate. What makes this diet unstable is Indian deployment of BMD and MIRVing for counterforce and preemptive strikes. And all of this is reflective of a shift from massive retaliation to preemptive warfighting doctrine with counterforce targeting strategies, which I believe dilutes India's own no first use. So I'm not going to talk more about MIRVing and all. Lastly, Pakistan's strategic calculations, I believe, are very, very important given as to how India is evolving its military doctrine. And while it continues to say that it faces a two-front threat whereby it has China and Pakistan to take care of, Pakistan's future strategic calculations, they need to consider to restore the strategic equilibrium, which is both being diluted by Indian conventional as well as nuclear force modernization. The question that I want to leave this audience with, and probably we can get more into in detail when we talk, is why would India continue to have a no first use doctrine and be willing to absorb the first strike and then retaliate as it gets bigger and better toys? All of these trends make this nuclear diet unstable. So I don't have anything positive to end this note on. I would be open to questions once we get to that. I'm looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists add in their bits. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia. You've raised some interesting and thought-provoking points. We'll come to those when we start our discussion. Now I would like to invite Ruhee Neog to speak to us on India's crisis behavior. Ruhee Neog is Director, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in India. She works on security and foreign policy with a specialization in nuclear politics and strategy. Ruhee holds additional appointments as board member of the International Nuclear Security Forum and fellow with the Sandia National Laboratories at the US Department of Energy. Her past positions include a dual fellowship with the Project on Managing the Atom and International Security Program at Harvard University, a South Asian Voices Fellowship at Stimson Center, and a research fellowship supported by the Nuclear Threats Initiative. Ruhee has a postgraduate degree in History of International Relations from the London School of Economics and an undergrad degree in literature from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Thank you so much, Ruhee.
Thank you, Ali. Rabia, you've set me up for a fall with that fantastic mind map. But before I begin, could I ask you, you made a point about India shifting from massive retaliation to something. Could I request a reiteration of that point, just so I can complete my note and jump into my own remarks?
Adding offensive capabilities, moving towards war fighting doctrine, not defensive in nature.
Thank you. And I think I'll come to that. I think that's an interesting point, and I'd be happy to come to it in the discussion that will follow. But thank you, Ali, for the introduction. And my thanks, of course, to CNS, to Dr. Porter, and to you for having me. Like with Rabia, Ali also set me a couple of questions. So what I've tried to do is structure my thoughts accordingly, and I will, of course, be referring to my notes, so I stick to the 5-minute deadline. Right. So, Ali, you asked what explains the change, right, as you say, in Indian crisis behavior. And here you refer to a greater proclivity in India to demonstrate more risk-taking. And the answer to this, at least according to me, is quite straightforward. And this is that this greater appetite for risk-taking, if you will, is a demonstration of political intent, right? Because, and I think Rabia also alluded...
Just a minute, Ruhee, we have lost your video. Can you turn that on. Okay, yes. Please continue.
Well, I will have to go back to my notes, in which case the video might shut off again.
It's okay.
But let me know. Right. So I was saying that, India, and Rabia alluded to this in her remarks, it has found itself hemmed in, and its hands somewhat tied in responding to Pakistan's use of non-state actors as a tool of state policy. And of course, it has found itself hemmed in because it has had to do so in the shadow or the threat of the shadow of nuclear weapons use. So this demonstration of Indian willingness, in my view, it points to a couple of things. And one of these is that it is experimenting with India's conventional retaliatory options, because then it is a consideration of the military choices that are available to India in the event of a terror attack that is linked to groups operating from Pakistan. And in addition to this, it is also a testing of Pakistan's red lines. The second way I would read this, or rather I would read the political and public proclamations around this, right? Because a lot of the noise also has to do with the frequency with which political leadership has resorted to invoking India's recent responses to instances of terror attack that have been in some way linked to Pakistan. And my understanding is that these proclamations are to signal that India, in fact, may feasibly be in a position to establish escalation dominance. And at this point, I think it is also worth flagging that while, as I said, there's been quite a bit of noise and there's been explicit political ownership, of India's conventional options, a consideration of limited aerial strikes as part of military strategy is, of course, not at all a new development. And the third way I would see recent Indian behavior is as an attempt to induce behavioral change, right? Which is to say that India seeks to signal that it can no longer be held hostage to the threat of some conventional warfare to which Delhi has, of course, for a significant period of time, found itself unable to respond. Now, whether India has been successful on all of these counts, I would say is fundamentally a matter of perception. Whether the message has been received in the way that it is intended. And in this regard, and we've discussed this extensively, Rabia, in track 2s and such, both sides seem to find it useful to perhaps let conflicting narratives of victory coexist in the interest of de-escalation. And this, I find, is a particularly handy political tool to manage crises. And this also then goes back to the point Rabia made about crisis behavior within the DAT. This demonstration of intent and willingness, I would say, is also a good segue to address the second part of the question, Ali, that you asked me, which is its impact on strategic stability. And of course, the term itself has mutated and tends to be assessed and defined in at least 3 different ways. For the purpose of the discussion, I'll flag 2 things. One is perception, and this is something I've already gone into briefly. So if India is flirting with limited conventional action, and that doesn't induce Pakistan to revisit its use of terror as policy against India, or rein in militant groups operating from its soil, that would mean that Rawalpindi is in fact not credibly convinced or assured that India would respond as it has done recently, right? In every instance of a terror attack that is linked back to Pakistan. So then I suppose what we could expect to see or what we are likely to see is more tit for tat action. And in these situations, going back then to Dr. Potter's point, it's never easy, and I don't always find it very helpful to try to reliably predict whether textbook de-escalation will occur each time. And that being said, the two tenets, again, that are worth flagging with regard to Indian behavior. One is that, of course, it firmly adheres to the tenet of nuclear weapons being for political purposes only, like China. And really, it is in its non-use that a nuclear weapon serves its greatest purpose. And the other tenet worth bringing up, of course, is India's no first use policy. I'm not going to go into very much detail on this because I feel like it's going to come up again in the discussion. I will leave it at saying that a review or a revisit doesn't necessarily or automatically entail a revision. Right? All of this being said, there is, of course, always room for this kind of confidence, right, and the ability to manage every crisis to be challenged. And this could be challenged by both complacency about the predictability of each other's behavior and what we think is a very fine understanding of the other because of our similarities and, of course, almost a common cultural context. And also not being sufficiently able to account for unknowns that could potentially lead to greater escalation. Finally, and I'll close on this, I think it is very important to examine the India-Pakistan dyad, nuclear dyad, on its own merits, right? But I do feel that it is also an artifice to evaluate South Asian strategic stability only on the basis of this dyad, right? Because then we are discounting the knockdown impacts of Chinese nuclear modernization. But also, more importantly, we are discounting the impact of China's relationship with Pakistan on India's threat perception. And as I say this, I will also note that equally then, it is important for us to account for American nuclear modernization and its regional repercussions. So I will end here. Ali, I hope I kept to time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruhee, for being succinct and incisive. And this makes for a very good discussion in the next few minutes. All right, now I will invite Dr. Christopher Clary. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany, State University of New York, and a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center's South Asia program. His book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia, was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, a pre-doctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, a Stanton Nuclear Security pre-doctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation, and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs fellow in India. Clary also served as country director for South Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, a research associate at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a research assistant at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Dr. Clary. Over to you with your remarks on the roles of third parties.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to CNS for organizing this. I'm always happy to be in Monterey virtually. I would be more happy to be there physically, so you should feel free to invite me in that regard as well. Let me sort of get into the issue with third parties through the back door, if you will. You know, I think my panelists so far have done a good job of sort of surveying the landscape and reasons to worry, or maybe in some cases reasons to be hopeful. You know, if I were to try to summarize why I'm optimistic about South Asia, if I was going to put on the optimist hat, I would say the reasons for optimism in the Indo-Pakistani dyad is, one, the Sino-Indian dyad is troubled, and that distracts India from Pakistan. It decreases India's interest in competing profoundly with Pakistan, because it doesn't have sufficient resources to compete aggressively in both directions. And similarly, Pakistan's own extended economic crisis which shows very little sign of abating, in my view, also encourages Pakistani elites in the military and the civilians not to fritter away limited resources on a competition with India. So I think that, that we began with Dr. Potter being skeptical of rationality, but the rational incentives, I think, actually do favor turning the temperature down, and whether that will be enough is unclear. We also, another reason to be optimistic is I actually think my read of the discourse in Delhi and in Pakistan is the period of large-scale land warfare as the coercive instrument of choice in South Asia. We may be exiting that period. I don't know if anybody has told the Indian Army that, but despite trying cold start and proactive strategy operations, it's not clear to me any civilian has really bought off on that idea. And the surgical strikes and the airstrikes, I think that's the coercion of the future. That coercion is quite dangerous, but I think the pathways to nuclear use from large-scale land operations are much easier to imagine than the sort of tit-for-tat spirals that aerial combat and even missile conflict. That's one of those things is easier to get to the nuclear use than the other, in my view. And I think the most dangerous period we may have exited around the time of the Mumbai crisis, when the civilian political leadership in India had no great interest in turning to the army as the coercive instrument of choice. So that's kind of all I've got for optimism, but I do have reasons to worry as well. I think Ruhee correctly said the global context of nuclear competition is not good. The Chinese modernization, the U.S. response to that, the Russian response to that, all of those are going to put pressure on India to increase its arsenal at a faster rate. And I think that will put pressures on Pakistan to respond in turn. I'm worried about that. I see no prospects for arms control in the near future. I'm quite pessimistic at the global level, and so I think they'll have trickle-down cascading effects on South Asia. We are at a period of enormous technical shift. We've had obviously a decade where we pondered whether there was a counterforce revolution or not, but that there are certain things that are in play now, and I think that will lead both India and Pakistan to be more comfortable with standoff weapons as they demonstrated in 2019. I think they would do it differently than they did in 2019 because obviously that crisis was perhaps more dangerous than Indian civilian leadership priced in. We are, I'm pessimistic over the medium to long term because we are getting a possible economic disjuncture between India and Pakistan, where India may have a prolonged period of 2 or 3% greater GDP per capita growth per year than Pakistan. And Pakistan's ability to maintain strategic parity will be called into question as that goes on. And the last sort of reason, or the second to last reason I would note that I am worried is I see so many shenanigans going on with India and Pakistan. It really seems like the intelligence agencies are doing lots of crazy stuff. I think there are the number of potential provocations that could lead to a crisis are at one of the highest levels I can recall for a while. And this business will get out of hand. And I think any of these things could lead to a crisis. I see no fundamental change in the sort of sparks that are flying around, and there's ample fuel on the ground to catch fire. So the willingness, I think, of intelligence agencies to engage in dangerous behavior seems unabated, in my view. Maybe moderated somewhat in Kashmir, but more broadly, I think I still have a lot of reason to worry. And the last area of concern, which relates to a thesis I sort of try to lay out in the book, is we are going through a period of profound political instability in Pakistan. I think that makes it difficult for the Pakistani political establishment to behave like a unitary rational actor, which is what we want for nuclear revolutions to take hold. On the Indian side, you actually do have an enormous control over the political system by Narendra Modi. We have different problems there. India is entering a gerontocratic era. Modi's old, Doval's old. It's not clear who is going to replace either of those gentlemen. And there is a lot of branding concern where the Modi brand is all about not accepting Pakistani provocations. And that may make it difficult for Modi to stand down in the face of anything where there's more violence than basically what we saw in Uri in 2016, about 19, 20 dead Jawans, and you've got a real crisis on your hands. So that's my area of concern. The last area of concern is actually what Ali told me to talk about, which is third parties, which is we are in a period where I am not confident in the US's ability to play an effective crisis manager. In the near term, I am not confident because the US is entirely bogged down by Ukraine and the Middle East. In fact, those two crises alone have outstripped US crisis management capacity. Anthony Blinken's basically parked in the Middle East. He's there all the time. Lloyd Austin is parked at Walter Reed. He's getting better for his medical condition. You take a look at the org chart over at OSD Policy, my old office, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. It's empty, man. Nobody's turning the lights off anymore. It's just the janitors over there. So the Biden administration is going to limp across the finish line. It's not clear who's going to replace the personnel that are exiting. The U.S. Senate dysfunction means that the political appointee pipeline is fundamentally broken. And the situation is, in my view, only going to be worse if Trump comes back. They're going to have appointees, but those appointees may be entirely disinterested in crisis management. And we have a good sense of how the Trump team is going to handle crisis management in the future, because in my view, they messed up 2019 quite a bit. And in fact, I think a seam between the National Security Council and the team that was deployed with Trump in the Hanoi summit. So people may not recall this, but in February 2019, India and Pakistan had a crisis. That crisis just happened to be coincidental with Trump flying to Vietnam to meet Kim Jong-un to talk about North Korea politics. Most of the national security team was with Trump. Most of the South Asia experts in the US government happened to be negotiating with the Taliban in Doha. And that geographical physical separation meant that the Trump team had an enormous amount of difficulty in responding to that crisis. And I think we only have a partial sense of how that crisis was resolved, in part because I think Ruhee very euphemistically said that both countries have decided competing narratives are helpful, but we just don't know what happened. People have not, I think, fully documented how that crisis unfolded. The US account is itself incomplete, and we have almost no sense of what the UAE and Saudi Arabia did to help resolve the crisis. They both have sort of whispered that maybe they helped a little bit on the margin, but the extent of their help is not clear. So I think one thing, and I'll close out with here, is we have a marching order as analysts, as scholars, is to figure out what happened in the recent crises, because the documentation of those crises, I think, is still quite poor. And that means that we've not been able to learn lessons because it is disputed what actually occurred. And I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from others.
Thank you very much for these remarks. And I do realize that successful mediation requires a lot of bandwidth on part of the mediator, and that bandwidth I think is not there anymore. Now, synthesizing all that our three speakers have said, we'll pose Dr. Jeff Knopf this all-important question as to what does all this mean for deterrence and the theory going forward. Just a week ago wrote an exceptionally thought-provoking chapter on the societal and psychological aspects of nuclear peace. So I'd like to call Dr. Knopf, who is professor and chair Non-Proliferation Terrorism Studies program here at MIIS. He's also a research affiliate with CNS and Stanford University Center on International Security and Cooperation. Dr. Knopf received a PhD in political science from Stanford University. Prior to joining the MIIS faculty, he taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of Southern California. Dr. Knopf is a former editor of the Non-Proliferation Review and has published research on nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, deterrent strategy, and how public opinion, NGOs, and social movements affect national security policies. Thank you very much, Dr. Knopf. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Holly. I have reached an age and point in my career where I feel happily capable of ignoring my orders. So I'm not quite going to wrap up and comment on what the previous three speakers said, but I'm going to make some remarks which I hope put some of these things in a larger context. And I should start by saying I'm not a South Asia expert at all. So Ali, Ruhee, Rabia, Chris, you all know a million times more about the region and its history than I do. I'm going to take Chris at least a little bit on a trip down memory lane. more than 15 years ago now, I think, I was teaching at the Naval Postgraduate School, and Chris was an RA and doing his master's degree there. We both participated in a conference. My colleague at the time, Feroz Khan, put together a conference that was intended to come at about the 10-year anniversary of the 1998 nuclear weapon tests by India and Pakistan. So he titled it "A Decade of Nuclear Learning?" ? And he very kindly invited me to write the sort of concept paper for the workshop. So I wrote a paper called "The Concept of Nuclear Learning," which was eventually published in the Nonproliferation Review. And I should say, this was not my concept. As far as I know, the first person to talk about nuclear learning was Joe Nye, who published a wonderful article in the late 1980s looking at the United States and the Soviet Union and the nuclear competition between the two of them. And in his article, he outlined several aspects of nuclear weapons policy in which he thought the US and Soviet Union had converged in their views in ways which helped them manage the relationship without it collapsing into nuclear war and with a certain amount of cooperation. Right. And so the question was, could India and Pakistan, follow a similar path? So in my article, I drew on some earlier work I had done on learning, and I said that we can really distinguish learning, if you will, as sort of two different levels of analysis, and I called these foreign policy learning and international learning. Right? And foreign policy learning refers to what individual states learn about their own policies and strategic postures, and lessons they take that might help them do better and get more effective results for themselves in isolation in the future. Whereas international learning was a term I used to refer to learning that is shared, where two or more parties come to a common understanding about something, which helps them navigate that issue in a way which avoids conflict, maintains peace, promotes cooperation. And this matches in some ways different ways that we can talk about deterrence. Right? So most of the time when analysts talk about deterrence, when states and their leaders talk about deterrence, what they really mean is my deterrent. Right? Do I have a deterrent posture that is effective at deterring my adversary? But sometimes we get outside of that and we broaden it, and we talk about, and Ruhee has already referred to this, we talk about strategic stability. Is the interaction between my deterrent and the other side's deterrent operating in such a way that we can avoid the worst, right? That we don't go to the abyss, fall into the cliff, and have a catastrophic exchange of nuclear weapons. In practice, most of the learning, if any learning, has taken place, and most of the claims to learning that people make in the subcontinent, they take the form of foreign policy learning, right? So government officials and scholars in India will look at how India's policy has evolved since the start of the nuclear weapons program, since the tests in 1998, and point to a set of things they've done that say, India, we're better today than we were in the past, meaning that they think they have a more effective deterrent. And exact same thing for Pakistan, right? And what I think is missing is that sense of shared international learning, right? I set it out as something that would be desirable to achieve at the 10-year anniversary of the nuclear tests. And now that we are at the, I kind of do the math in my head, but 25, 26-year anniversary of the tests, I'm still not sure that they're there. So the learning that I think has taken place actually reminds me of another scholar, a former colleague of ours at Middlebury College, our parent institution in Vermont, Russell Lang. And Professor Lang, over the course of his career, did a series of articles and books in which he developed a model of learning that he called realpolitik experiential learning, which is essentially a pattern that he observed countries go through when they go through a series of crises, right? And they learn lessons from experience, but the lessons they draw are very hardline realpolitik lessons. So if one country takes a more soft-line diplomatic approach in a crisis and it gets a bad outcome, it draws the lesson, next time I should be tougher, I should be harder. Right? If a country takes a hardline approach and it gets a good outcome, it draws the lesson, hardline approaches are good, and next time I should double down and be harder still. Right? And if both countries are learning those lessons and they experience a series of crises, you get a ratcheting up effect. they just both get more and more hardline and more confrontational over time, right? And so the question is this, with some hindsight now, is this the pattern we've seen, right? And I think it is in a lot of ways, right? When you got to the Uri crisis in 2016, India for the first time actually launched strikes into Pakistani territory. Right? We get to Pulwama in 2019. India does this, but this time Pakistan retaliates with its own airstrikes into Indian territory. Right? So you see the process of escalating up. But it's not 100% true, right? And so, Chris started optimist and went pessimist. I'm going to do mostly pessimist, a little bit of optimist, and then unfortunately I'm going to end pessimist. But you do see some glimmers of recognition of nuclear dangers. So, for example, in the 2016 crisis, when a Indian plane was shot down and the pilot was captured, the pilot was returned alive to India relatively quickly as a goodwill gesture. More recently, when an Indian BrahMos missile seemingly went off course or was fired in the wrong direction by accident and landed on Pakistani territory, Pakistan didn't make a big deal of it, and what could have been a very serious crisis didn't escalate. So you see little glimmers that maybe the two sides are recognizing nuclear dangers and they don't want to get too close to burning their hands on the nuclear fire. But I'm still not optimistic overall, in part for reasons that all of the other panelists have alluded to and which have been talked about for a long time. If I can go back to Nye's original analysis, in the United States and the Soviet Union, there was sort of a disconnect, right? So there were military plans, right? Targeting plans, military doctrines that were fairly warfighting, right? Both sides had intentions that if it came to it, they were going to fight and win a nuclear war, and they were set up to do so. But there was a disconnect between that and the political leadership, the civilian political leadership in both countries, in part because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Dr. Potter started with, seemed to really sense that nuclear war was just an unacceptable outcome. No benefits could possibly justify the costs. And they wanted to be very, very careful. And so they sort of behaved in ways that were disconnected from their military strategies. Things like the BrahMos incident suggest that maybe there are elements of that thinking in India and Pakistan as well. But unfortunately, there are some structural differences between the relationship between India and Pakistan, versus those of the United States and the Soviet Union, that are very well known. But unfortunately, I think they make the situation more dangerous. Right? There's still unresolved territorial disputes over Kashmir. Those didn't exist in the U.S.-Soviet relationship. You have non-state actors and cross-border terrorist attacks that are wild cards and very provocative that didn't exist in the US-Soviet relationship. I think the main dimension of difference is also different, right? It was an ideological difference, capitalism versus communism in the Cold War. It's not clear to me the Soviets really cared that much about communism by the time you got into the 1950s. It was a tepid ideological competition. The main fault line between India and Pakistan is religion, and I just think religion is just a whole lot more powerful as a motivator of human behavior than political ideology in ways that increase anger, decrease tolerance, etc. And then many of the speakers have alluded to domestic politics in the two countries. Both of them are very unsettled and volatile right now in ways that I think could encourage playing the nationalist card and playing the hardline card for reasons of domestic, political regime survival and legitimization. So, Ali asked me a question about deterrence. I think my bottom line is that in both India and Pakistan, there's too much deterrence. They're too attached to it. They try too hard to make it work. They're too narrow in their focus on deterrence. What we need to see is more of a sense of shared fate, common dangers, common interest in avoiding war, a focus on stability, and a greater use of reassurance strategies rather than deterrent strategies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Knopf, for bringing some really interesting points to the table, especially on the lack of international learning, and this sets the stage for a riveting discussion. And I already see Dr. Potter's hand raised. Please, Dr. Potter, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ali, and I want to thank all of the speakers. I thought this was very stimulating, and I had not really planned to kind of weigh into in the discussion, at least at this point in time. But Jeff's reference to Joe Nye's work on the U.S. Soviet relationship and the extensive study that I've done over the years on the U.S. Soviet, U.S. Russian experience in cooperating in the nuclear space, and particularly with respect to non-proliferation, suggests to me some questions that I don't have answers for, but they draw upon the U.S. Soviet, U.S. Russian experience, and I'm curious the extent to which they apply today in South Asia. So first of all, I mean, I see as a major problem with respect to the U.S.-Russian relationship is the loss of institutional memory, both the memory of cooperation in terms of engaging in crisis diplomacy and crisis prevention, lessons learned for what worked, and also lessons learned for what didn't work. That memory, in my assessment, is largely absent in the foreign ministries and the security councils in both countries. And so I'm kind of curious whether that applies in the South Asian context. Related to that, to some extent, in the U.S. Soviet and U.S. Russian context, was what had been in the past very extensive and intensive personal contacts in negotiating different treaties and agreements. I mean, in the non-proliferation review process, the same individuals for a very long period of time interacted. They trusted one another. They were engaged in other arms control activities, be it at the First Committee in the United Nations, at the IAEA, and the like. And so often these individual diplomats were able to steer their countries down a more prudent path than might have otherwise been expected. Those interpersonal relations simply don't exist anymore. The key players have either, literally passed away, or they are no longer significant policymakers. And thirdly, so I'm curious about whether that's relevant today in the Indo-Pakistani relationship. And thirdly, where an outside observer might come to the conclusion that there are definitely shared interests in the nuclear space, and can point to the kind of need for international learning of the sort that both Joe Nye and Jeff talked about. My impression today is that there is no recognition of those shared interests, particularly on the Russian side. And if one's talking about the loss of something very significant in both capitals, Moscow and Washington, I would argue there simply is zero respect, there's zero empathy, and there's zero trust. So I'm curious the degree to which our experts on South Asia see any parallels between what I've described, if I'm correct, in terms of the U.S.-Russian relationship today and what exists currently in South Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter. Would any one of you like to take a crack at it, Dr. Rabia? Maybe because you also have recently worked on these parallels and shared interests.
Yes, sure, Ali, but do you want to take it in order? I was just about to raise my hand. There is Philip Bleek and Ruhee Neog waiting.
Yes, we can do that. Okay. Yes,
And
Dr.
then I'll
Blake.
come in there.
Dr. Blake, can please, yeah.
For
Yes.
sure. So I guess one mode is you might collect a couple questions and then open it to the panel
Yes.
So I have a comment that will turn into a question. So first off, I just wanted to appreciate this is a really lovely panel. And in particular, this sort of nicely evokes for me my sense of Ali's presence on our campus. I have had the good fortune to have Ali in a couple of my classes, and I just really appreciate the kind of energy and enthusiasm that you have brought to your studies. And this is a kind of nice encapsulation of that in many ways. And I love the set of people who you have gathered here. So this is really lovely. So I have a reflection that is also a question, which is, I am so struck working on these issues, in particular from a US perspective, by how much it feels to me that we misunderstood our antagonists over time. So from a US perspective, when we thought about China or we thought about the Soviet Union, there were also often things that happened for domestic, parochial, internal political reasons that we thought were about us. And we have such a terrible track record of understanding, I would say, from a US perspective, China in particular, but I think in many ways also the Soviet Union. And I suspect, I'm not a South Asia expert, but I suspect that that applies to a surprising degree in South Asia too, that India and Pakistan misunderstand each other to a surprising degree and interpret actions that each side takes as being about them when they're often not. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a question, and I'd love to hear other people reflect on that. But it's my sense that notwithstanding the cultural similarities and other reasons why one might expect them to understand each other quite well, that they actually perhaps understand each other surprisingly poorly, and that that's a source of some danger in this context.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blake, for these remarks about me. I have really learned a lot from you. So Dr. Clary has to leave a tad early. So I would ask him to take a crack at these questions, and then he can leave, and we can continue our discussions.
Thanks so much for that. I'm sorry I have to leave early. I'll have to watch the rest of the recording subsequently because I am learning a lot here. I think this issue of the fact that we don't have a shared empirical basis for the crises is worrisome. Dr. Potter asked, are the people in the establishments in India and Pakistan that still have a muscle memory of negotiating cooperation? Some, the National Security Advisor in India is 78 years old, so he's learned a lot, he's forgot a lot, so he and India and Pakistan did manage to negotiate a ceasefire pretty recently, which is good. They have a ceasefire in line of control for the first time since it broke down roughly in 2013. But the number of people in India that have deep Pakistan expertise and vice versa is declining. I think the commonality of language sometimes leads to some hubris on both sides about the level of knowledge that they really do have. But the interchange is limited. People-to-people ties have been quite anemic. There are not high commissioners, ambassador equivalents in either capital. Diplomatic relations have been spartan for some time. There's a lot of intelligence harassments of diplomats historically, so those diplomats don't actually get to go out and really live fulsome diplomatic lives. So the last, serious, difficult confidence building measure that both sides negotiated, I think it's arguably decades. Really easy CBMs they've been negotiating for the last 15 years. And I don't think there's deep muscle memory in either side to do this again, and that is worrisome. Let's take just one episode that's come up that I think is worth studying that I haven't mentioned, and then I'll close out because I know my panelists have other important thoughts. This accidental BrahMos launch. You've seen some publications recently in Pakistan that suggest it might have been sort of basically a covert test of Pakistani capabilities. I haven't heard, in fact, Indians say this to me. I don't believe this to be true. There are ongoing court cases in India because the Indian Air Force officers that were dismissed as punishment for their involvement in the accident have tried to sue to stay, to keep rank and pensions. I think that's a lot of people to get in onto a conspiracy once you bring the Indian judicial system on board. There is some, I think, interesting media reporting going on about the BrahMos accident. And I think when I read that media reporting about what happened at the BrahMos accident, I think immediately of Scott Sagan's limits of safety. it appears that somebody forgot to remove a mechanical component, and then in a test firing up exercise, they started pushing a button, and the button, when they pushed on the screen, it said, "Don't do this. You're about to launch a missile. Are you sure you want to launch a missile?" And they said, "Oh, it's just an exercise." They removed the firing component, so we'll just hit that button. And the missile went off, and it was pre-programmed with coordinates in Pakistan rather than be pre-programmed with coordinates in the ocean or the desert or somewhere where there would be no danger of casualties. And there's a series of mistakes that were tightly coupled, and there was things that were complicated that interacted with each other in unpredictable ways. And we are lucky that it just happened to hit like a fence post and not anything serious. So when I look at the shared understanding of what happened in 2016, there's a disagreement about what happened with those surgical strikes. When you hear the Indian Air Force talk about what happened in the 2019 versus what the Pakistan Air Force says happened in 2019, wildly different stories. And then this BrahMos escapade as well. So I am very worried that the parties can learn the right lessons since they don't agree, at least in public, maybe in private they do, about what happened. And so that impairs nuclear learning and maybe tilts it, as Jeff said, in the sort of Russell Lang realpolitik direction, where everybody just decides next time they got to be more forceful, more quid pro quo, and next time it will turn out better. So I look forward to hearing more about the discussion later, and thanks, Ali, for the opportunity to join.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clary, for your excellent participation and contributions. Thank you. I would just like to ask Muskan to to ask a short question, and then we'll ask our speakers to focus on to answer the questions of this round, and then we'll go to Dr. Joshi in the next.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ruhee, Dr. Rabia, and everyone else who spoke today. It was a very insightful topic and a very interesting conversation. So I just have a quick question from Dr. Rabia. And I don't know if I heard it wrong, but if you could please clarify as to what you mean by non-state actors on both sides.
I had a question actually, and I'll begin with that. Ali, this question is to you, so I can put you in the spotlight. I find it interesting that you use the term nuclear crises in the title, and I would say then that question assumes that there have been several nuclear crises between India and Pakistan. So I'd like to understand a little bit of your thinking on that. With regard to this discussion, I think excellent discussion. It's nearly 2 a.m. in Delhi, and I'm wide awake. Also, thanks to the large cup of coffee that I had minutes ago. I'll respond to some of these questions. Since Christopher didn't touch on the question, Dr. Potter's question about personal contacts and interpersonal relationships, I would say that, yes, I suppose earlier periods in history would have seen far greater interpersonal relationships just based on the degree of contact and, I suppose, common backgrounds alone. And that, of course, would have sort of diminished over time. With regard to where India-Pakistan tensions derive from, we tend to sort of always zero in on the nuclear component. And this keeps coming up again in track 2s that both Rabia and I are engaged in. I'll flag 2 points. One is that, in fact, it derives from fundamentally territoriality, right? And this predates everything else. And what a single-minded focus on the existence of nuclear weapons tends to do is it deprioritizes or reduces the role of a whole host of other issues that feed into the India-Pakistan dynamic. The second thing I'll flag is, we've had several conversations here around shared learning as opposed to, I suppose, unilateral learning, and how that can lead to a further entrenchment of specific positions that don't contribute to strategic stability. And a term that came up interestingly in, again, a track two context was how the India-Pakistan relationship is informed by, and this was a term, I can't take credit for it, it was a term used by one of the participants, intimate enmity, right? And this notion of intimate enmity tends to color the relationship, the approach, and the narrative very differently than it would have, for example, the United States and USSR during the Cold War. Now, despite this intimate enmity, which would therefore then provide the cultural background for a kind of understanding, and this is something I alluded to in my remarks, it can also lead to a degree of complacency about what you think your expectations of behavior from the other are. And that doesn't necessarily always coincide with one's own assessment of self. So I will post that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rabia, would you like to answer this
Yeah,
package
sure.
of questions?
Sure. I don't think I have answers, but I'll just make some statements. Just a short reply to Muskan here. So I also, in the same breath, probably said when I talked about non-state actors on both sides, Indian, involvement with Baloch insurgents in Pakistan and its funding for TTP, so it serves as a proxy. So I hope that gives you some clarity. With respect to what Dr. Potter asked about, and what Professor Knopf also talked about, that there is a need for international learning. And I do agree that there is a need for international learning because so far, India and Pakistan have not exhibited shared learning. At least there's, like Chris said, that there is no empirical evidence to suggest from 1999 up till 2019, in a 20 years period of time, that there has been some learning that has happened. But, in one of my researches that I'm doing with Matt Byrne and Dr. Manpreet Sethi in one of our working groups on revisiting nuclear deterrence at Belfer. So my case study is on Kargil and Balakot, and I'm writing a Pakistani perspective of it, and Dr. Manpreet is doing the same, from the Indian perspective. And we have looked at, strategic stability overall. And in this 20-year period, it's really interesting as to, what has come up with respect to strategic stability, whether it has increased or decreased. And what I can tell you at this point is that despite, all that might seem to you from a distance, a diet which is really unstable, and is really getting more complex by the day, there is some sense of shared interest in not going nuclear and annihilating each other. I think there is no due acknowledgement given by the literature that comes up mostly from the West and looks at nuclear diet of India and Pakistan and calls this region the nuclear flashpoint, does not acknowledge that the sense of rationality that prevails between, the Cold War diet, the same sense of rationality that nuclear weapons are not to be used just for the reason of sheer proximity of India and Pakistan, that rationality holds. And I don't see anybody giving India and Pakistan that credit, in their scholarship. Ruhee and I are also, co-authoring a piece on the non-attack agreement. And when all of this talk about Russia taking over Zaporizhzhia and Ukraine came out, and the world was saying, okay, fine, why is it not how is it a nuclear power plant a hostage? these nuclear reactors should be a no-fly zone, non-attack zone. And here we are, looking at a 1988 agreement, which has stood the test of time over so many crises. And yet, the world does not acknowledge enough. So I understand that this diet is not perfect. I'm not being too overly optimistic or overly confident. For some, it might be misplaced optimism. But even if India and Pakistan are not talking to each other in public, yet listening to the back channels and the third parties, and the crisis is being managed, I would take that any day. At least some conversation, some rationality is prevalent somewhere. It's not in the public domain. It's not documented. I know it should be, but it's a process of 20 years only. And they will be learning. You cannot look at 50 years of Cold War and say that India and Pakistan should get there in a jiffy. I think India and Pakistan understand what it means, to have this stability and stability paradox, which is operational, and not let it be there for all times to come. So all I'm saying is that if we zoom out and we stop looking at the trees and we look at the forest, there is clean air up there that's going to keep both countries sane, hopefully. To Professor Bleak, misunderstanding each other. I think, when Ruhee talked about internet enmity, we, had some conversations over some track twos between India and Pakistan. And I just say what I've said earlier, but perhaps a bit differently. I think there is an understanding of as to who we are. There is an understanding that deterrence needs to hold, because if deterrence dilutes, or if one country gets an edge over the other, it's downhill from there. Dr. Feroz is here. He's done a lot of work on nuclear learning. Might not be too optimistic, but I do believe that we need to pick some success stories of sanity and rationality prevailing in this diet, and then let that be a starting point. I know there are too many negatives, but if you continue to focus on the negatives, you do not give the governments on both sides, the military on both sides, the organizational pathologies on both sides enough credit that they've got this. Yes, accidents can happen. Yes, there are limits to safety. And, they'll be learning from all of this. I think it's just too soon in the 20 years journey. And yes, there have been crises, but I think it's I don't want to sound complacent, but I want to be confident based on the positives, in this story, that so far we have got this, and hopefully going forward too, the lessons are being internalized. Yes, they aren't public, but the lessons are being internalized at both ends. So this is sounds like my Eid Mubarak notes to everybody. I'll stop here.
You are ever the optimist, and I see reason to that as well. Thank you so much. Dr. Joshi had a question. Dr. Joshi, please.
Hi, Ali. Thanks. Yeah, this has been a great seminar. Thanks for organizing it. I don't have all that much to say, to be honest, but I'll just make the point that just from my reading over the last several years of different crises in South Asia, I think for the Indian side, the focus, especially in the more immediate short term, has been to build up its conventional deterrence capabilities in trying to deal with different border crises with China. So I think that requires a bit more attention from the deterrence perspective. The nuclear angle is important, absolutely, and on the nuclear learning side, and I think that's been a really interesting theme that has emerged from this discussion based on what Jeff and Dr. Potter have talked about, and I'm glad that that Brigadier Feroz Khan is here because he's been at the forefront of a lot of these projects and interactions and track to dialogues, which I think go some way in promoting this kind of at least shared interactions and hopefully some degree of nuclear learning. So I'll just say that to me at least I think the conventional side and the need to deal with different crises on a conventional basis, whether for India with respect to Pakistan and vice versa, and for India especially in trying to figure out what to do with China on these with respect to the ongoing border crises. I think that that's the big sort of immediate issue right now. On the nuclear side, yeah, it's going on. You've got a build-up taking place, and I think the fact that both India and Pakistan are kind of looking in different directions in that sense. They're not really looking at each other when it comes to the buildup of their nuclear weapons capabilities, because as we know, for India, it's really China, which is the key concern from the deterrence perspective. For Pakistan, it's India, but they're not really looking at each other from that angle. So that complicates the nuclear learning aspect and might be a bit of a difference from the Cold War history. I'm just going to sign off here, or at least mute myself, and hopefully Feroz has something to say. I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi, for these remarks. Yes, conventional deterrence has always been something that has enchanted me. In fact, in 2019, after the Pulwama crisis, I happened to be at Stimson, and there I was adamant on writing a memo on conventional deterrence. I had numerous discussions with Dr. Rabia, and most of the people in the DC area were saying, no, this is not something that resonates with us. But I was able to pull through that. So yeah, conventional deterrence is very, very important, because I believe deterrence is not only nuclear. It is a lot more than that. One thing before I move to other participants, I think Dr. Potter in the previous semester was he spent a lot of time in the simulation class on looking at the theoretical aspects of decision making. And the reason why I believe he talked about spent a lot of time on those Graham Allison's models was that whatever your opinions about coercion, deterrence, or compellence are, they stem from how decision makers view them. So I believe decision making processes are important to dabble in, especially in times when new weapon systems, new technologies, and new environments are being shaped. So thank you very much. If anybody has a question, please raise their hands. If not, then I have a question to read from the chat box. Doc Nabil, yes, please. You're not audible, Nabil. Maybe, yeah. Yep.
Audible now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ali, for the seminar. I have just a quick question and a comment. The comment is that with regards to this crisis communication with India and Pakistan, it seems more fragile in the contemporary times. because we have a series of incidents, for example, the BrahMos misfire, and then the MIRV test by India. And then we see that there is a stalemate, that from 2014 onwards up till now, there is no communication between India and Pakistan with regards to several crises that happened, as Dr. Rabia also mentioned. My question is with regards to this doctrinal ambiguity. Don't you think that this doctrinal ambiguity is the key requisite for the stalemate in crisis communication between India and Pakistan? Because as we see the series of crises that happened, there is no doctrinal transparency. So that this doctrinal ambiguity is giving more stretch towards more crisis between India and Pakistan. Anyone from the panel can answer my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nabil, for this question. Anyone from the panel is welcome to answer this important question.
I might hop in
Yes.
on that
Yes.
one because it also relates to the very nice exchange that happened in the chat. I think that Rabia is quite right that you can sometimes get very productive forms of cooperation without having to have talks first. And we care about the outcome, and the ceasefire, which Chris also mentioned earlier, is a very positive development. But talks are useful for more reasons than just whether they produce an agreement or not. So, if we're going to talk about sort of shared learning, having discussions is one of the ways in which you produce that shared learning or learn that it exists. So, Robert Jervis in his book about the nuclear revolution that Ali mentioned has a brief passage where he talks about the experience of nuclear arms control between the United States and the Soviet Union. And most people evaluated arms control by looking at the numbers, right? Were they coming down? Were they stabilizing, et cetera? And Jervis said that in some ways, the numbers were not even the main point. It was the fact of talking to each other and having meetings where senior people were both present, where they could essentially both say to each other, I know that you know, that I know that you know, that we both know that we could never do anything that would take us too close to a nuclear war. And so I think talks actually are important, and cooperation without dialogue, you lose some of the benefits of having the dialogue. Let me also say, Rabia, I would love to see you write an article about the untold story, if it is in fact true that there are lots of little indicators out there that a shared understanding has been emerging over time and not getting commented on by the analysts. I see a great giant window of opportunity open for you to sort of write that up and publish it and put it into the empirical domain so that we can see this hopeful sign that this is happening, and maybe also generate a little bit of snowball effect where putting it out there that this is happening encourages more of it to happen.
I might consider this, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Knopf, for this excellent, all-embracing remark on this doctrinal dissonance problem. And it all boils down to, in my opinion, a lack of communication, lack of substantive communication, if I were to say. I would like for for Brigadier Feroz to share his brief remarks on this entire edifice of topics. Brigadier Feroz, you're...
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Sharath, for sending me the link. I was able to join, so it'll be unfair of me to talk on everything that was talked because I joined very late, the later part of the discussion. But I just wanted to bring one particular point because that was repeatedly brought on the question of nuclear learning, and especially as it applies to South Asia. Since Jeff, my colleague, former colleague and friend, Jeff, you're there. You must have mentioned, I don't know about the nuclear learning project that we did, but almost many.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did, Feroz, and Chris was also on the call earlier.
Right. So I just want to refer to that particular part because, like, how many times we're going to keep meeting again and again after decades and talk the same point again and again and again? in a different set of circumstances. But you are the one who actually brought out this point, really the concept of nuclear learning in part of the project that we did, and it's probably published now somewhere. I want to draw your one particular point that you brought in that essay of the concept of nuclear learning and as it applies to us today. That time we were talking about in 2008, immediately after Mumbai, if you recall, that we were trying to see what was the decade of learning from 98 to 2008. And here we are really in the middle of 2024 with several other crises, not a single lesson that we were talked about to prevent. Neither India nor Pakistan learned anything, and they went into different kind of crisis. Except for one point that I want to mention that Rabia is mentioning, but if you noticed, and since I brought this point in my latest book about, and a lot of people have drawn me on that particular issue, that the degree of crisis between India and Pakistan is actually the nature of violence in the crisis. India and Pakistan has actually reduced, not increased. If we are looking back from Kargil down to the time that there was a shooting war in 1999 to a standoff of about 10 months in 2002, and then we gradually see that the nature of crisis eventually started getting down to from a cold start doctrine to full spectrum deterrence down to surgical strikes and quid pro quo strikes and all those things. You can see that you have completely changed the manner of conducting crisis with each other in a way, So if that is some kind of a shared learning, that may be something to really explore. I'm not saying thing definitely at the moment. But I wanted to draw your point about something that you brought in your essay, if that can be, it was a theoretical point, a distinction between simple learning and complex learning that you brought out, Jeffrey, if you remember. And in a very simplified form of understanding that a simple learning process is that when the strategic environment changes, for example, geopolitics has changed, technology has changed, politics has changed, so much has changed, generations have changed and gone with different tools of understanding. A simple learning process indicates that you will continue to have the same goals and objectives with each other in an adversarial relation, will not change your goals, not change your objectives, even though everything under your sun and under your feet has changed, but you don't change your goals. Now, I'm not going to say because it's going to be turned into a bad thing, but India and Pakistan have not changed their goals whatsoever with each other. They continue to treat each other the way they were treating each other in 1947 to date. Whichever way you want to describe it, that simple learning. The other part was the complex learning that you brought was that the moment you realize that the environment has changed so significantly and that your strength and your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities combined does not allow you to continue to attain the same objectives that you thought was your national objectives, say 50 years ago, you change your objective and you determine your objectives and the national objectives in a way that is doable to you and brings about more survivability and progress to your people rather than keep on staying with the same old thing. So there's this difference of simple and complex learning that I'm afraid to say that South Asia simply learns, not does the complex learning of changing the objective towards each other. In other words, the simple way of learning would be that you will continue to do either cold start or surgical strike, but your objective is the same. And the Pakistanis will continue to do this deterrence, for full spectrum deterrence, quid pro quo, your objective is the same. You're not changing your objectives to realize that what is doable, what is not, politically, militarily, and strategically. And if you really closely examine the strategies of India and Pakistan, nothing seems to have changed. Very little nuances have done. These technological innovations are actually coming into the arsenals, into the inventories of India and Pakistan, but the strategies are not changing. Now, these are some of the things which is causing of all those things that was, at least in the later part of the discussion that we discussed. And the only point that Sharad Joshi asked me to speak in was that because of these changes and because of lack of change of objectives, what is happening is that the deterrence coercion level, Ali, you brought this point about the equation, deterrence compellence level is blurring so much that the countries are likely to commit a very huge mistake without intending to do though. That is an inadvertent sort of possibility between India and Pakistan, even though there may be stakes, nobody wants to go to war, nobody wants to create the crisis. Something Rabia was alluding to, I would say, despite all the shared understanding, you will continue to do the mistake because you're not changing your politics. So that's all I'm going to say. Sorry for the long diatribe. But Jeff, you can say, is that what you meant in your essay, theoretical essay, or you meant something else? If I interpreted you wrong, so please correct me.
Feroz, you've got it 100% correct, but in fairness and giving credit where credit is due, the original distinction between simple learning and complex learning was Joe Nye's in his original article, and I just reported it. So I can't take credit for the intellectual contribution.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feroz, for your incisive remarks. And I should urge everyone to read Dr. Brigadier Feroz's new books, Subcontinent Adrift. It's a fantastic book which moves beyond the conventional debate on strategic stability and looks at, in fact, it is the first book that actually talks about Pakistan's conventional responses to the Cold Star Doctrine. No book has so far talked about the army, the 2010 conventional doctrine that the Pakistan Army introduced. Everybody talks about the Nasser missiles, but nobody talks about that doctrine. So Brigadier Feroz's book really talks about that in great details. Thank you very much. There is a question by one of our former students, Munib. It's a good one. We have already our speakers have already answered this question. Yes, we need to change the discourse on strategic issues from mere counterbalancing to talk about shared learning, shared responsibilities. Dr. Knopf and Dr. Rabia talked about this particular point in great detail. Dr. Potter, if I may request you to, so you have done a lot of work on Soviet decision making and how the Soviets thought about nuclear crises, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. Do you think there are some lessons for us to learn from that? Because I think this will really make the discussion quite all-embracive.
Well, actually, I was just typing in a message saying that I have another appointment. And I'm going to have to depart. So I'm going to make my response to your question very, very brief. It's very difficult when you talk about countries' perspectives to distinguish or to try to accurately characterize what may be a prevailing view among policymakers as distinct from the views of a few key policymakers. And so I kind of caution against attributing thinking to a country as opposed to different groups of players who are maneuvering for position. But I think one thing that we've seen recently highlighted by the war in Ukraine is that what we took for kind of granted as a position has evolved rather rapidly, as best we can tell, although there's still great uncertainties in terms of what is in fact Mr. Putin's perspective on nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. The only point I think that I can make that is, it's a much longer discussion, and I don't really have time to go into it, Ali. But I think that the one concern that I have, which I see as very pronounced in the U.S.-Russian relationship, and I'm kind of curious whether you see this, the experts see this in South Asia, although I will not have time at the moment to listen to your response, is I think a profound and misplaced confidence in new technologies and a reliance on these technologies and their country's ability to manage escalation, notwithstanding technological developments. And I see that as exceptionally destabilizing. we've had so many close calls. At least I can speak about these close calls in the U.S., Soviet, and Russian context. And my great fear is that in the current international environment, the bilateral relationship, if those crises were to be repeated, that the outcomes would be, very different. And so, again, this was very, very interesting. I really appreciate the exceptional presentations by all of the participants and the audience. I learned a lot, so I want to thank all of you. But typically we close our seminars, after an hour and a half, and certainly after an hour and 40 or 45 minutes, I'm going to have to go to another meeting. But thank you all, and I hope next time we do this, we can do it in person in Monterey. So you all have invitations to join me here, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thanks so much, and I leave it to you, Ali, to handle the wrap up here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter, for your inspirational leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter.
So thank you so much to all the participants. It has been a riveting discussion. We have tried to touch all aspects of strategic stability, whatever you make of it. I think complacency. So we should neither be complacent nor be despondent. So there are a lot of gray areas between complacency and despondency, and we need to look at those and need to identify windows of opportunities. I once again would like to thank all my guests, especially from South Asia. It's 2:30 in India and it's 1:52 in Pakistan. Thank you so much, and it would be a pleasure to see you all in person in Monterey in a not too distant future. Thank you.